Welcome back. Conversations, episode 3. We've got much better sound quality this week than we did last week. I apologize for that. I realized after I had recorded the entirety of episode 2 that I had been using my computer's microphone input instead of the microphone that I bought for this podcast. So you unfortunately got K-Bex coming live from his bathroom studio last week, but we will not have that happen again. That's our goal, a little bit of progress each week. So we're back on the correct mic, and hopefully you can hear us a lot better from wherever you're listening, and we appreciate you guys for tuning in this week. Got a big show coming up today, a lot of topics to discuss, primarily about football, both professional and college football. Some topics we'll discuss there. But excitingly, we've got our first mailbag items to dip into. So we'll cover those at the end of the episode. Those of you that send in those questions, thank you very much for doing that. Stay tuned. We'll cover those today. And for those of you that are interested in interacting with the podcast moving forward, there's lots of ways to do so. We're on all sorts of social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, at KBEX_ATC, Instagram now. And, of course, if you'd like to send us an email, we are at conversationspod@gmail.com. So interact with us. We love it. We want to hear from you. That's what this is all about. So, yeah, just diving right into it. Last weekend was a landmark, or I guess you could say a watermark for the sports calendar. We've got both college football and pro football back in full force for the first time this year, and that'll last us until early January. So it's a great time to be alive as a sports fan. We love having both Saturdays and Sundays full of football action. And I was having a conversation with my buddy earlier in the week, and he was talking about how much football he was able to watch last weekend, and started to make the connection of, hey, maybe the tide has turned here and my spouse is not going to get on me for watching football both days all day. And I kind of had to stop him because I've seen this movie before. And my thoughts on that are no. Unfortunately, for those of us that do want to sit around and do nothing but watch football all day, both Saturday and Sunday, and for the sickos out there, other days of the week as well, I do not think that the tide is necessarily turning for us in that regard. As much as Taylor Swift's involvement in the NFL and being associated with Travis Kelce has maybe brought some new fans into the fold, I think that you're seeing what we typically see at the beginning of the football season. And the reason I think we see that is because football is by nature woven into the cultural fabric of American society at this point. I saw, or actually heard, a stat the other day that of the top 100 televised events in 2024, over 90% of them were football games. So football is king in this country, and along with that comes everything that people associate with football as well. And if you're not a huge fan of football and you suddenly saw it on all day on Saturday and Sunday last week, you can now associate some other things that maybe you like even more than football with the start of having that back on TV. So it's about game day parties with people. It's about game day chili. It's about hanging out outside and having a fire if you're in the Midwest, or maybe even if you're not in the Midwest. But it's all those things that are associated with football, I think, that help us, at least during the first few weeks, watch a little bit more than we will be able to as the season wears on and the novelty wears off, because people are just happy it's back. It truly is part of our culture, whether or not you're donning the face paint and the jersey and sitting back and watching it all day with 6 different screens up, or if you're just somebody who likes to partake in the activities. But I don't think that we'll be able to see us watching 8 hours uninterrupted of college football and pro football on Sundays come week 5 or 6 of the NFL season. But let's see. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have different thoughts or you experienced something different during last week's events, let me know. I'd be very curious to keep that topic going if it's interesting to you guys. But I can tell you one thing, it does make it easier to get the go-ahead to watch a lot of games if the games are perceived to be bigger. And last week I saw some frustration from some people about the number of games that featured what you would call the big-name teams, the blue bloods, the high-ranked teams, versus some teams that maybe a lot of people wouldn't even know where to pinpoint them on the map. And I see this as something that is maybe a little bit of misplaced frustration at this point, because the argument that I saw, or the frustration associated that I saw, was that why are we scheduling these games, or why are teams scheduling these games against these little guys, against these nobodies, when we have a 12-team playoff? Why aren't they simply scheduling games like Texas versus Ohio State every week during the non-conference schedule before we get into the conference schedule? And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but I don't see it going away by any means, even as we move towards a further expanded playoff. And of course, we are going to a further expanded playoff in college football. We're not done at 12. Anybody who's been paying attention knows that it's going to expand here, probably in the near term. But some of those reasons that I see that going steady in terms of these larger programs scheduling the smaller guys, number one, it is an opportunity for these guys to get ready for the conference season. And I think that that's more important than ever now, especially with the amount of turnover that we see on teams thanks to NIL and the transfer portal. And it's important for these teams to really have early tune-ups to get their teams gelling with each other. There's a lot of new faces on these teams, even the big teams. I mean, we look at the top teams right now: Ohio State, Notre Dame, Texas. These are teams with relatively inexperienced guys at key positions, and it is imperative that they get time to work with their teams to see some success on the field, and that comes with these tune-up games, generally speaking. And coaches are not going to go away from these because of the value that it provides for them to be able to work with these young guys, work with these guys that have not played with each other much, to be able to get ready for those bigger games during the season. And yes, while you can argue a loss doesn't necessarily kick you out of the conversation for the college football playoff, you still want to be in a position where your team is coming in feeling confident, that you're feeling confident as a coaching staff when you get to those conference games. Because if you end up playing 3 teams that could beat you in the non-conference, you may be coming in, number one, in a precarious position from a record standpoint, but then also from a confidence standpoint. The guys on your squad are not necessarily buying into what you're trying to do. So there's a lot that can be done by playing those smaller schools. Usually they're going to end up as pretty comfortable wins for the big programs. So I think that's definitely a benefit, and one of the reasons why you'll see some programs continue to schedule these little guys. The other thing, and this is more for the health of college football as a whole, is that these games where the smaller program comes in to play the bigger program, and a couple of the examples that we saw last week were Florida State playing a team in, I believe it was East Tennessee State, and Ohio State playing Grambling State, is that those smaller programs are essentially, paying the costs of their program by scheduling these games. So, hundreds of thousands of dollars are being paid to the smaller schools, sometimes more depending on who the school is, to come up and play these larger programs. Yes, they know what they're getting into in terms of what's going to happen on the field in most circumstances, but the financial value that comes from those games is very important to these teams. And I think for the health of college football, if we want to see the continuation of your P4, call it regular contenders for the playoff, but then also more of what we would consider to be historically traditional college football, which are those G5 programs at this point. We need to have these games continue to happen. So I personally see no issue with the tune-up games, especially early in the season. I don't think they're going to go away. I think that the programs themselves understand the value of them for a number of different reasons, but wanted to cover that because I did see some frustration last week, and I think that sometimes a number of those games on the schedule get people to come to the conclusion that it's a slow week, for example. I did hear that a couple of times last week about week 2 in college football, that it was a slow week, and I don't know that I would agree with that. I think that there were a number of games that were worth watching, and then in terms of those big guys against the little guys, I think we have to understand why they're there, and hopefully that can help us come to terms with seeing a couple of those on the schedule every season for our favorite teams. But yeah, those were some interesting conversations that I saw last week, at least within my smaller group chats. But one topic that was, I think, dominating the off the field headlines as far as college football was concerned was surrounding the AP Top 25 poll. So to give some background to those of you that may not be familiar with that, or just to re-summarize, since it has been a few days since the storm was really brewing, the AP Top 25 pollster named Haley Sawyer was caught in the crossfire, essentially of her own doing, thanks to some interesting choices that she made with her ballot that was submitted after week 2 last week. And more specifically, what Haley decided to do with Florida in particular was move them up a couple of spots in the ranking despite their loss to South Florida over the weekend. And in addition to that, South Florida was nowhere to be found in her top 25 rankings. Now, we'll discuss the intricacies of that a little bit more here in the next few minutes, but the biggest issue that Ms. Sullivan made was not her picks in general, but in how she handled the situation after people started to realize what had been done and started asking questions. She decided to take matters into her own hands and release a video to explain her process and explain why she decided to make the picks that she did. Now, as somebody who is quasi-associated with the media, I can understand why you may feel it could be valuable to go on record and clear the air about the decisions made, but in Miss Sawyer's case, I really think that she made a big mistake by addressing the issue at all. In the end, there was really no true explanation for what she did other than the fact that it was a mistake. Nobody who covers college football, and she does cover college football, she is a beat writer for USC, would make the decision to move a team up in the rankings after a loss. So I think we can all agree that this was a mistake. It was something that should not have happened, but because it happened, you were going to get some negative feedback. If I were in her position, I would have simply ignored the issue, because we're talking about a poll here that essentially is tucked within the archives after the next poll comes out. And Ms. Sawyer is not the first person to make some unusual predictions or unusual choices with her ballot. Coming out of the woodwork when this started to gain some attention nationally were the number of voters who had made similarly unusual choices with their ballots in the past as well. So she's not alone here in making unusual choices, but she is in a unique position in that she decided to come out and release a video trying to explain her reasoning. And within her reasoning came the other issue that she made, which was that she essentially pulled back the veil on the ugly truth about the AP poll. And what she essentially said was that there are so many voters that it works itself out in the end, and we know that it doesn't have that much impact on the grand scheme of things. So effectively what she said was, this poll doesn't matter. Now, I will give my opinion on that moving forward, but the mistake that she made here is that she essentially alienated everybody who was paying attention to this poll. Firstly, she alienated the fans by telling them something that they rely on to get a sense of what's going on in college football doesn't matter and therefore shouldn't be paid attention to. Not a good idea. But perhaps more importantly, she alienated her own group of writers who also have an AP ballot to fill out. And why I think this is important is that pulling the veil back to expose the ugly truth about the AP poll, which is, truthfully, after the college football playoff rankings come out, nobody's paying attention to, is that you are essentially taking away a very important piece of value that the voters have that helps them build a followership. Lots of us, myself included, would love to have an AP ballot to fill out, to be able to say that I fill out an AP ballot. It immediately gives some level of trust and expertise to what you are saying with everything else that you publish. And by saying it doesn't matter, she's taking that badge away from those other writers. And building a followership is very important in this industry. It's essentially what drives people to click on your articles, which is what's going to make your bosses happy. So when she says that it doesn't matter, she's not only angering the fans, she's angering the other journalists. And they're sitting there thinking to themselves, why are you saying this? You're taking away my verified status, essentially. Because without being able to say that you're an AP poll voter, you're just some guy or gal with a podcast who's talking about it. So I really do think that's important. I think that that's going to be, unfortunately for her, the aspect that she's really going to have to put a lot of work into to build back trust on, which is her colleagues in the industry. And it's something that is really should never have happened with somebody who is a professional journalist. I mean, this is frankly 101 stuff in terms of how you would handle a snafu with regards to something that came out in the public and how you handle that on the back end. But my perspective on this is that she's not entirely wrong about the situation, with the exception that there is some level of influence by the college football playoff voters that the AP poll provides, at least in week one. You cannot tell me that the college football playoff voters, which are essentially doing the same thing that the rest of these voters are doing, which is looking around and seeing what the rest of the group is saying about certain teams, don't have some level of bias about who they're putting into their own rankings in the middle of the season. And the AP poll, to date, has been that source of information. So while she's not necessarily wrong, the way that she handled it was incredibly wrong. And I wish her the best of luck moving forward, because one of the things that I tried to do was get a little bit of background on her. And as I mentioned earlier, she's a beat writer for USC football, so that's her main job, is to focus on USC football. But this is a responsibility of hers as well, and it needs to be taken seriously if she wants to build trust amongst her readership and also with her colleagues. And unfortunately, the way that print media works these days, she has had no favors done for herself by the fact that nobody can validate whether or not she knows ball, because all of her work with her outlet that she does work for USC football, is behind a paywall. So I was hoping to be able to come on this podcast and tell you that I read some of her work and that she really knows USC football, and that we should give her a break as far as what she knows. But unfortunately, that opportunity does not exist unless you want to pay to read the work. So that's something else to keep in mind for future scenarios, young journalists out there. Remember that you may not even have a chance to defend yourself with all the work that you've done in the past, given the landscape that we deal with as far as print media is concerned these days. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to shift over to the mailbag, dig right in there for the first time ever, and cover the questions that have been brought to us over the past week. And this first one is actually a comment that was left on our Spotify page, but we'll consider that the mailbag as well. And it comes from Matthew, and Matthew asks, how do you compare Shedeur Sanders and Arch Manning? Why is Arch seen as an elite talent after a bad game, and Shedeur is mocked and ridiculed? So first off, thanks for the question, Matt. I think that this is actually a very interesting topic because it's not as much about the play on the field, but about how these two players have been handled by their teams off the field. And I think there's a huge difference in how these two have been handled. And I think it helps explain exactly the question that you asked, which is why is one essentially being lifted up while the other is seemingly pushed down at every opportunity possible. So first off, let's put these two into context. Shedeur Sanders, of course, the son of Deion Sanders, played for his dad at Colorado, and Deion was essentially a one-man marketing show for his son, or sons, I guess you could say. And what Deion did was very similar to the way that he handled his own personal career. Very flashy, a lot of bravado, confidence, and all news was essentially an opportunity to bring Shedeur's name into the limelight and let Shedeur do what he does best, which is perform on the field. And for the most part, this approach worked very well in college because Shedeur had elevated himself from a guy playing quarterback at Jackson State to moving on to a Power 4 program at Colorado, being a very good player there by all accounts, and getting himself squarely into the conversation as one of the top quarterbacks heading into this past year's draft. But contrastly, when you look at what Arch Manning is currently going through, it's almost a complete 180 in terms of how much attention Arch's team is trying to bring to Arch. The media, of course, is going to jump all over this, right? He is the grandson of Archie Manning. He's the nephew of Peyton and Eli. He's the next guy within the lineage of the first family of football. Hard to look away from, frankly. But what the Manning family has done, and I do think it's the Manning family who is his team, but also perhaps very smart people that the Manning family have been able to make connections with throughout their decades being involved in college and professional football at a high level. A very concentrated effort to make sure that Arch doesn't have to answer for anything in the media has been made by that team. And what I mean by that is Arch is not going off, giving off sound bites week to week. He doesn't have to explain for perhaps lackluster performances like the one that we saw week 1 against Ohio State. He doesn't have to explain why he came into the season as the Heisman Trophy betting favorite despite not having played a full season of college football. And I think what that allows for Arch, as opposed to Shedeur Sanders, is the prevailing sentiment from outside voices to write the narrative about what he is. Arch doesn't have to play extremely well for people to have positive things to say about him. There's so little that he has done to create his persona at this point that it essentially writes itself. And because everything up to this point has been so positive, he's an extremely mature guy. He's waiting his time, he's waiting his turn to be the starter at Texas. He's got a great head coach in Steve Sarkisian. He's got the great lineage. He has all the arm strength in the world, which we really haven't seen at the college level, but we've been told that that's the case. All of these things allow the narrative to just work its way through. Whereas with Shedeur Sanders, the media didn't necessarily come up with the opinion that he was one of the best players in college football. That was Dion who was telling everybody. And then Shedeur had to go prove it on the field. And of course, there were detractors and there were people who did not believe that was the case, but he did have to go and prove himself in order to even get to the point that he was at coming into the NFL draft. And so I think when you talk about why is somebody seen as a darling in conversation, whereas another is mocked and ridiculed, to use Matthew's words, it comes down to Shedeur built up that reputation through play on the field. And now that that reputation has been built upon that and he's not getting an opportunity at this point to do that anymore, the perhaps original opinions that people had about him are now starting to resurface. So Shedeur is right now not even taking scout team reps with the Cleveland Browns. And the Cleveland Browns, of any team in the NFL, are a team that would be looking for answers under any rock or crevice or unturned stone possible to save jobs. At this point, Kevin Stefanski and his staff are looking for answers. It's hard to believe after just one game, but it's also not hard to believe knowing what we know about the Cleveland Browns as a franchise. And if Shedeur Sanders had it, there would be opportunities for him to show that, or at least to be in the conversation. And at this point, a guy who is not even taking scout team reps for a franchise that is likely full of individuals looking for answers to save their jobs is telling about his abilities on the field. And that's what his reputation was based on, is his abilities on the field. Whereas with Arch Manning, it's been built up. It's based on a family name. It's based on all the positive things we've heard from others and the lack of things that we've heard from him. So thanks for the question, Matt. Again, I think that was a really interesting comparison to make between two guys, especially right now, given where Shedeur Sanders is at in his professional career. So the second mailbag question that we have comes from, well, actually, they say who it comes from, so I'll save that until the end, but we'll go ahead and we'll read it off. So, you tell that Paul Findelbaum that he is wrong about Bama. Nick Saban is coming back, and the tide will roll again, so you bootlicker. Food for thought, maybe give your own top 10 college football rankings. People go nuts for that. But I also don't know if you want to avoid the pandering aspect of that. Okay, love you, bye. Phyllis from Mulga. Well, thanks, Phyllis. First off, I'm with you about Bama. I don't think that they're dead in the water this season, but they definitely have some work to do. So we'll see how that goes. I don't see Nick Saban coming back, but I think that Kalen DeBoer can do it for them. But to your point about a top 10 for college football, I am not afraid of the pandering of that, and we'll go ahead and we will answer your question about who I think the top 10 in college football is right now. And part of the reason I think that this is interesting is based on the discussion we just had about Haley Sawyer and her rankings, I think that it is absolutely an opportunity to spur discussion, to talk about who your top 10 is. And I won't go through my process. I'll just tell you my top 10, and I'll go ahead and I'll stop on some of the teams that may have more surprises than others in the position that I put them. So I'll start from 10 to 1, and we'll go through, and then I'd love to hear people's thoughts here after the episode. So starting with number 10, I've got the LSU Tigers. And I think this one is probably a surprising one for people because LSU is currently number 3 in the AP poll. But I am not sold on the Tigers yet. I know they've got the win over Clemson, and normally I would consider that to be enough to convince me about a team's capabilities, but I've really been disappointed with Clemson so far, and I'm really hanging on by a thread in terms of my hopes for them to do what I thought they would do coming into the preseason or coming into the regular season. I didn't like what I saw from LSU last week against Louisiana Tech, and if you've read my article on Around the Corn Sports blog, the Week 3 preview, my upset of the week is actually Florida beating LSU. So if I am right, then I think LSU ends up lower than this position coming into next week's AP poll. And if I'm wrong, then people have the opportunity to jump all over me for this one. So LSU at number 10, I'm not as high on them as some others are. At number 9, I've got Illinois. Illinois is a team that I have a lot of faith in so far this year. I've got them in the Big Ten title game, and last week was a prove-it game. They were coming in as a less than 3-point favorite against Duke on the road. Duke was seen as a team that really could give Illinois trouble if Illinois didn't bring their game, and Illinois pulled away and showed what they can do on both sides of the ball. So far, I think Illinois has shown me what I expected to see of them, and they've got a really big game coming up next week that'll help solidify their position in the top 10. At number 8, I've got Florida State. And I think this is another one where people say, wow, that seems pretty high for a team like that. But I was high on Florida State coming into the season. I think that Coach Norvell is on a mission to prove that last season was a complete and total fluke. And I think that they are going to have the opportunity to not only compete for the ACC title this year, but if it ends up being a team like Miami that they could face in the ACC title game, I think that's one that they could win. So this is definitely a college football playoff contender at this point. The win over Alabama, I think, raised some eyebrows, but this is a team that coming into the season, I think, was capable of working their way into the top 10. At number 7, I've got Notre Dame. Not going to go too much into that one. They've got a big game today against Texas A&M that'll possibly define their season. If they lose this game to Texas A&M, it's going to be very difficult for the Fighting Irish to work their way back into the college football playoff. But if they can get by the Aggies, I think the rest of the schedule sets up nicely for the Fighting Irish. Number 6, I've got Texas. And I haven't seen a lot of positive things about Texas since their loss to Ohio State. Last week's game against San Jose State was probably seen as a throwaway game by most, but the Spartans are a better team offensively than they've shown through 2 games, and I think that there's a possibility that game may come back and look like a pretty decent win by the end of the season. Not that Texas necessarily needs that. They're going to have plenty of opportunities to prove it in the SEC slate, but I did not see enough against Ohio State to suggest that they're not still a team who is firmly in that top 10 ranking at this point. Number 5, I've got Miami. I think they've done a nice job. I think the win over Notre Dame is respectable at this point because I still feel Notre Dame is a top 10 team. And so until Miami loses a game, I think that they are deserving of a top 5 ranking, and I have got to give credit to Mario Cristobal because I did not think that the Hurricanes were going to beat Notre Dame, and I actually have them losing a few more games this season. So I have been proven wrong so far about the Hurricanes. It's still early, but at this point, they've shown me more than I thought they would. Number 4, I've got the Georgia Bulldogs. Not much to say about this team. I think they've gone about their business so far. I talked at the onset of this podcast about how they were seemingly being overlooked by most of the country, which is probably how Kirby Smart wants it. I think if they can get the game done against Tennessee today on the road, that people are going to start to really buy into this team. Tennessee's got a good offense, and so if Georgia can shut that down and control the pace of that game, I think it will prove that the Bulldogs are a pretty talented team this season. Number 3, I've got Penn State. This was the team that I was the highest on coming into the season. I've dropped them a little bit only because I've seen better performances from the 2 teams ahead of them, but there's no reason to suggest that the Nittany Lions aren't one of the best teams in the country right now. They got their first shutout in years last week against Florida International. Not that that's a huge result, but it's a testament to the defense firing on all cylinders at this point and the offense being able to take care of business as well. Number 2, and this one is one that I'm actually kind of surprised with myself about, that I have them ranked this high, because I was not high on them coming into the season, similarly to Miami. And that's the Oregon Ducks. And Oregon hasn't really played the best competition to date. However, I don't think you can look at a game like last week's against a Power 4 conference team like Oklahoma State and not be impressed by the way that Oregon just dominated every aspect of that game. And Dan Lanning, I think, has a chip on his shoulder based on how last season ended. I was a little bit concerned about the number of pieces that they had to replace on both lines, but it appears that that's not an issue right now for the Ducks. And maybe I'm being sold by the scoreboard, but the Ducks look very strong right now, and I think that I may have been wrong about them as unable to contend not only for the playoff but for the Big Ten title. I think the Ducks are squarely in that conversation at this point. And then number 1, the Ohio State Buckeyes. No reason to put them anywhere except for this position. They've got the best win of the season over Texas, and the Buckeyes were firing on all cylinders through one half last week against Grambling State before they started to pull their starters. So the Buckeyes are number 1 until somebody knocks them off that perch. They've deserved that ranking. So that's my top 10. Let me know if you want me to do that on a week-over-week basis. I'd be happy to do that. We can go through it pretty quickly unless there are major changes here. But I'd love to hear your comments, your thoughts, your questions about all things sports. Remember, we are not just a football podcast, so I know we've been discussing football at length here in the first few episodes, but we are happy to discuss anything that comes up as a question for you. We watch all sports except for cricket. I don't know anything about cricket, so don't ask me about that. We'd have to pull somebody as a guest onto the show to make that one worthwhile. But again, we're on all socials: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Reach out to us, conversationspod@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, and thanks for listening. Until next time, take it easy, Shuckers.